Okay, wonderful. So post-growth economics, sound foundations for systemic transformation. Yeah, I think first of all, why this title? Why systemic change? Why post-growth? So this is kind of, I think I would like to structure the presentation through in three blocks. First, why systemic change? Look into the current state of socio-ecological crisis. Then give you an introduction into post-growth economics, and then do an assessment in how far post-growth or degrowth can be a pathway for systemic change. And so why systemic change? I guess I don't need to tell all of you that we're in a deep ecological crisis. This graph is kind of showing temperature rises over the last million years. And if we just look at that part on the right-hand side, it's the last few decades. And there we see like the speed and scale of temperature increases. And the authors of that study come to the conclusion that it's actually that we're moving towards Earth system states that are far outside individual, societal, and species experience. So actually something that humanity has never experienced before. It's also the ecological crisis is not only about climate change, but actually about various planetary boundaries that are being transgressed. So it's about land use change, it's about biodiversity loss and others. So it's actually a very complex crisis. At the same time, we have huge inequalities on a global level, but also within countries. This is global income and wealth inequality. Where we see shares of national income going to the top 10%, which is more extreme with regard to wealth and income. So we've got a real issue of inequality, and we've got the intersection of ecological questions and questions of inequity. Here we see accumulated historical CO2 emissions. So I'm referring to this block on the left-hand side, where we see that emissions since 1850, and we can take these numbers maybe with a pinch of salt, but so we see actually the regional distribution over time, and we see that historically North America and Europe have contributed most to ecological breakdown in that sense, climate change, and it's also continuing today. So here we see emissions by emitter group also on a global scale, and we see the top 1% having a large share, but also if we look at the top 10%, they actually contribute to almost 50% to all global emission consumption related. And so what needs to happen? We need to have this massive decline in emissions. We just came out of the last COP, and we see that, here the study from 2020, that we're actually far off track from where we would need to be to achieve a 1.5 degree target. And so the challenge is to address a multidimensional crisis in extremely high speed, so reaching net zero by around 2050 on a global scale. And then here I'm citing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that we actually, and here we get to that question of system change, pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degree with no or limited overshoot would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, and industrial systems. And then the rates of system changes that would need to happen, and looking at historical evidence, we see that some of these rates have happened in specific sectors or in specific contexts, but there is no documented historic precedent for the scale. And so here we become aware that we really need a deeper transformation of the economic system. And then especially when it comes to economic thinking, we need to go outside of the box and leave certain accepted paradigms behind, others the endless pursuit of economic growth. And so post-growth economics is kind of taking on that challenge, and especially from that environmental ecological perspectives, looking at the connection between economic growth and carbon emissions. We see here just for emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So we see that the last 200 years of capitalist economy since the Industrial Revolution has actually shown the most tremendous increase. And that today, this is data from 2018, there is a strong correlation between CO2 emissions and income here in per capita, and it's the upward slope of that curve that is evidence for that. And then when we look at the promise of green growth is underpinned by the idea of decoupling. So to say that we can have economic growth while at the same time reducing economic impact. And there's various studies that investigate the occurrence of decoupling. And when we look at, like here, this is again on the global scale, global GDP and the global material footprint, like the dark line, we see that there is a close and no real indications for decoupling. And with CO2 emissions, the green dotted line, it looks a bit better, but again, speed and scale are insufficient. And so this idea of green growth and technological solutions might actually be misleading, and just because studies come to that conclusion that there is no empirical evidence for sufficient and fast enough absolute decoupling, especially when it comes to material use, but also with regard to CO2 emissions. And then when we really investigate studies that investigate the technological changes, the reduction of carbon intensity of economic output, like we see that we're really very far off of what needs to happen. I didn't put this in the presentation, but during the COVID pandemic, there was actually comparison being made with the carbon emissions that were being reduced during the long periods of lockdown, where we see this is actually kind of the comparisons. I think 8 to 10% that were being mentioned. Imagine this was kind of a stop of the global economy and halt of the economy, and so this is what we'd have to see for the next decade. So it's quite a challenge. And then coming back to degrowth and post-growth, it's not only about the ecological critique of economic growth, but there are different other approaches. So it's about socio-economic critique now here in terms of GDP as an adequate measure of welfare, because a lot of many things that are environmentally or socially destructive are being counted. And other things that contribute to human flourishing are excluded. And we also see that, beyond a certain threshold, it's actually economic growth appears to have little or no positive impact on well-being. Other approaches from that critique focus on the issue of inequity and injustice, especially about exploitative North-South relations and contemporary production and consumption patterns on a global scale being highly unequal, and also gains of economic growth being highly unequally distributed. And from a feminist point of view, there also is an analysis of the gendered relations that underpin growth-based production and reproduction. So it's really a complex critique of economic growth, but also beyond. And just to do justice to the whole field of research, it's not only a question of economics, but there's actually different disciplines that contribute to research on degrowth. And also, it's not only research on degrowth or post-growth. It's actually not only about research, but there are movements on degrowth. There has been a big conference in European Parliament. So it's actually also kind of an approach that takes hold in political debates more. But today's topic is more on the economics, on the academics economic side of things. And here we have a common ground in that field is a shared concern over socio-ecological crisis and the problematization of economic growth and green growth as a solution, and the need to really move to a different, more ecologically and socially sustainable economy. Even if I talked a lot about GDP and economic growth right now, degrowth and post-growth is not only concerned with reductions in GDP per se, but it's about an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short and long term. And so the approach is to say, large changes will happen. So in view of that necessity, let's start thinking about how to become slower by design and not disaster. And another final point is that important point is actually that due to these historic and contemporary inequities, degrowth has mostly focused on countries in the global north. I tried to extract in my PhD, so this is comes out of my PhD, kind of the different shared directions for change within degrowth and post-growth economics. So to have an idea of the overall scope of changes, so it's from more to less, but it's also, and maybe more importantly, even from the primacy of profits and growth to a primacy of need satisfaction within planetary boundaries. It's from moving from brown to green, also from production to reproduction, so valuing more highly reproductive activities that are currently undervalued. It's also from moving to labor productivity to resource productivity. Degrowth and post-growth economics takes a more skeptic approach towards technology. I mean, the range is big between, in terms of the reliance on technology, and it's not necessarily hostile, but at least there is a skepticism or a critique also of what technology can do. It's also about slowing down processes. It's about rethinking the geographies of economic activity, so moving from global to local. From commercial to voluntary, and also to rethink, to move from a conception of private wealth to one of common wealth and more democracy. And then on the policy proposals, so there are various proposals also, like on the global scale for alternative forms of living, grassroots mobilizing, and on the policy side, which is also where the economics and the macroeconomics looks most, that we've got a multitude of policy proposals. So in terms of really the dealing with the most urgent ecological questions, there is the call for resource and CO2 caps and extraction limits, which means phasing out fossil fuels but ensuring a just transition. Different proposals for taxation, basic income and income caps are being proposed to deal with issues around inequality, and different social security guarantees to ensure need and sufficiency oriented provisioning. Working time reduction, reforms of the monetary and financial system. And so we've got a whole a diversity of policy proposals that many degrowth proponents share. And so now, now moving to the theoretical and methodological foundations, it's actually interesting to see. So there is a diversity of theoretical and methodological approaches that are being used, which include many heterodox school of thoughts. And so I think you have come across quite a few of them already in your lecture series. But what is striking is that there is a dominance of post-Keynesian ecological economics, and methodologically, there is a focus on macroeconomic modeling. And so it's interesting because there is this focus on macroeconomic stability, on pathways, on modeling pathways of declining growth rates, and how to ensure a macroeconomic stability in terms of employment, debt to GDP ratios, and other factors in view of constant or declining growth rates, and also looking at and social issues. And so it's interesting, these approaches, they actually allow to combine historical data, assumptions about behavioral relationships, and assumptions about future changes and possibilities. And so in that sense, these modeling exercises can give an idea of the potential pathways that the economy could follow, and also the changes that would be necessary to bring them about. And it's possible to play with different variables and weighing different effects to gain an idea of potentialities for change. By the same token, I would problematize this focus on these modeling exercises. And this is first because many of these models use parameters that, when we look at really the question of systemic change, need to be put in question. And I'm quoting Hart and O'Neill that there is the assumption that these parameters will be valid in the future, and that might be especially problematic in a post-growth context, as the purpose of the model is to describe and test a very different system. So that is a challenge with regard to the specific approach of modeling. And then also, when we look at some of the examples, we see that actually some of the post-growth trajectories that appear to be possible actually rely on assumptions that break with a general logic of capitalist economies. So, for example, no net investment or no accumulation of private wealth. And there we see that it's actually, there is a break with actually some of the fundamentals that constitute current economics. And so, while on the one hand we can gain like an idea of what is possible, on the other hand we might underestimate potential conflicts and struggles that would be required to bring these changes about, and the challenge of such transformation might be underestimated. And moreover, it's less possible to explore the qualitative changes in the conditions and in relations that would be required to achieve these pathways. And so, looking at the connection between method and theory and the political implications, the argument here is that alternative and other approaches would need to be strengthened in post-growth economics to make it more fit for systemic change. And that is exactly the analysis of post-growth in light of contemporary capitalism. So we look at the system as a complex whole, interdependencies at the very underlying social relationships, the dynamics to which they give rise, and also to the contemporary forms of capitalism, and there to really look at what are the historic specificities of our current economic system that lead to the very specific social ecological crises that we see. How do they bring about these crises, and how does that link to post-growth ideas? And in that section, I just take a sip of water. I would like to present to you this kind of framework that I developed in my PhD, and that I kind of used in order to just have an awareness of the different dimensions of the capitalist system that we need to take into account. And I'm happy that you did. I think the introduction to Marxist political economy you have done a few weeks ago. So you might be familiar with some of these concepts. And so it's really about, I use this framework just to be aware that on the one hand, it's important to be aware of what is the main goal and the driving force of the economic system. And here it is profit and capital accumulation captured by the formula MCM dash. So using money to produce commodities that can be sold at a profit. So it's profit making at the core, and this is actually what then structures commodity, the way that needs are supplied. So we have main goal and driving force. We need to look at the underlying social relations that bring that dynamic about. So this is 2. Then focus on the dependencies that emerge from this specific setup of these social relationships. And so in degrowth and post-growth economics, there is a focus on growth dependence, but also that there are other dependencies, and I will go into detail in a bit, that has been neglected slightly. We also, and here we move to the other side, looking at tendencies, where I would argue economic growth is an outcome of the setup of these specific social relations and must be understood as such. And then finally, the dimension of contemporary forms, to not use just an abstract kind of depiction of a capitalist economy, but actually look at, okay, how does this play out right now in the 21st century after a pandemic, after years of financialization? And so it's really, to have that historic specificity. And so I'll talk you through these dimensions and what the link is to moving post-growth. So first, as I have already started, about the main driving force of capitalism, which actually, and this is actually at the core, is profit making, and that is having a primacy of profit is just stands in the way of having a primacy to need satisfaction for all within planetary boundaries. And when we look at what are the specific relations that underpin this drive, is that actually you can make profit via producing commodities to make money, which is also then connected to people's dependence to have a money wage, in order to have access to basic goods and services more widely. This again, we have that, the connection to private and unequal ownership of resources, because only if people do not have access to the means of production and reproduction are they dependent on purchasing commodities on the market. And so this exploitation of wage labor in the production process and the appropriation of uncommodified labor in nature are actually underpin these dynamics of profit making. And the pressure then for corporations, for companies is actually to engage to engage in this specific way of commodity production is actually that there is competition on the market, and you need to make profit and establish yourself on the market to remain in the game. And so it's kind of, the focus on these very fundamentals of capitalist economies have been neglected in degrowth and post-growth economics, even if I would say that the last few years have shown a much, a rise in engagement with these elements. And so moving to the capitalist tendencies, as I said, I think it's important to appreciate economic growth as well as geographical expansion as an outcome of the system and not as its primary driver. An understanding of technological change that is geared towards raising labor productivity to increase output and profit is important to understand why there is a lack of decoupling, why technology might not be used to just achieve a sustainable scale of production that satisfies people's needs, but that it's actually driving the pursuit of growth and profit. We've got an acceleration of economic activity that implies faster resource use and throughput, while being pursued in order to also accelerate economic activity and accelerate profit making. Enclosures is understood as kind of the rendering of public resources into privately owned goods, which is essential for capitalist economies that rely on an unequal distribution of the means of production and reproduction. And so at the same time, it represents it represents and perpetuates the unequal distribution and the lack of alternatives in the system. Commodification means ever more goods and services are being brought into the logic of profit making, and by that, through that dynamic, it's actually even always less possible to escape from the necessity to engage in commodity production and consumption. Concentration and centralization describe patterns of capital, the growth of entities, a tendency towards monopolization, and then alienation, which describes the division between workers that happens through the specific production process, but also between people, human, non-human nature, and is actually a more subtle form of kind of creating disconnecting us to each other and the living world, and therefore perpetuating and accepting its degradation. And so I'm coming to, it's a bit of a run through that theoretical framework. I hope I'm not losing you. But I kind of try to capture this by talking about dependencies. And there is in the post-growth economics debate a focus on an analysis of growth dependencies. But as I say, from this specific setup, we actually have a systemic dependence on profit, on the existence of wage labor, and unequally distributed property as money, as a universal element that facilitates commodity production and exchange in large scales. And when we come to the final dimension, contemporary forms, really looking into globalization, financialization, and what I call here increasing rent orientation is really important, because yeah, it makes us aware of the specific configuration of global production network and supply chains, of inequities that yeah, in international trade, and yeah, these hierarchical structures that lead to these economic, social, and ecological inequalities. When it comes to financialization, we see that in the last few decades, there's been a phenomenal expansion of financial assets and financial activity. So actually profit making that is somewhat or appears to be disconnected to actual production. And then rent orientation is actually profit making on the basis of ownership and control of essential assets, so that's land, but also intellectual property and technology. And so this graph kind of captures some of these dynamics. We see GDP that has risen, yeah, from 1980s to 2016 here, the graph, but also key factors here. Trade has increased, foreign direct investment and financial assets, debt stock, as alongside with carbon emissions. I'm referring here mostly to, yeah, to the economics variables. And so, yeah, understanding these contemporary forms of capitalism is key because, yeah, first to understand this global rise of industrial production, but also to see how different regions are connected to each other. For example, that the offshoring and outsourcing of production has actually led to the offshoring and outsourcing also of environmentally and socially destructive activities. And when we investigate some of the decarbonization strategies in the global north, we see that these kind of outsourcing, these possibilities of outsourcing have facilitated decarbonization in the global north. In terms of financialization, just to name a few factors that are important, is really to recognize more the power of financial institutions over national economies, over governments and other agents, which might actually, yeah, which reduce the possibility for progressive policy making, for progressive changes in the economic system. Also, to understand the growth imperative, there's a whole debate around growth imperatives within the post-growth economics field. Yeah, that arise from a debt-based monetary system, even if there is a debate of, yeah, how much of an imperative that is, but there's definitely a drive. The increase of debt in the last few years having also increased well, production and consumption, or fueled it. And yeah, and some of the ironies is actually the question of stranded assets, which when we now see the need to phase out from fossil fuels, that there's actually the risk of stranded assets, and therefore the risk of like financial turmoil when we pursue a fast reduction and phase out of fossil fuels. So this is just giving you just like a taste of why it's so important to also analyze these these contemporary configurations. And so when we then come somewhat to a preliminary conclusion about systemic change via degrowth or post-growth. So not all degrowth and post-growth approaches are like openly anti-capitalist or critic of capitalism, but we see that actually systemic change is explicit or implicit in some of these models. Well, first, because as I already said, it's about setting different priorities in the economic system. So prioritizing need satisfaction and ecological limits over the pursuit of growth and profit. It's also about decoupling welfare and need satisfaction from economic growth. And then these envisioned directions for change run counter to some of the general fundamental tendencies of capitalist economies. And we don't need to go through all of this, but I just try to contrast the different directions of change that within post-growth and degrowth and the different capitalist tendencies. And there we see that there's actually, quite some clashes that need to be taken seriously also then in the proposals. How am I doing for time? I've done half an hour, is it?
Around half an hour.
Good. So maybe I'll just do a few just a few examples. So just the idea of downscaling, moving from more to less, contrasts with economic growth as a fundamental driver in capitalist economies. The desire to move from a monetary and material wealth to the good life within planetary boundaries is actually contrasting to that pursuit of commodification. For example, moving from commercial to a focus from a focus on commercial activity to voluntary activity also has to do clashes with drive for commodification, but also with increasing forms of alienation, because it's actually about reconnecting in a non-monetary way. And so you can actually go through these different dynamics and find that the ambition for a systemic change is somewhat inherent to degrowth economics as such. So degrowth and post-growth economics still is an analytical framework, an important analytical framework to address the social ecological crisis. And within economics, I would actually say that it's one of the few frameworks that has appeared and that really takes that challenge of social ecological crisis very seriously and takes it at the heart. So it's really a framework worthwhile pursuing further. But then I would argue that really to anticipate and deal with potential disruptions and imbalances, as well as adverse repercussions that might transformation, it's necessary to go further. And this is also important to then identify and overcome systemic barriers to transformation that arise from capitalist institutions, tendencies, and dependencies. I'm repeating myself, contemporary forms, but then also to look at the interdependencies between sectors and regions. And here, for example, the focus on countries in the global north has been justified by global inequities and historical kind of ecological debt of countries in the global north. At the same time, to really understand the interconnections and potential feedbacks that might ensue from a degrowth transformation, really must look at these interdependencies more closely, just to avoid negative feedback. For example, on countries in the global south who are dependent on exports of manufacturing goods, who are dependent on exporting fossil fuels, and so to not just create negative feedbacks that one would avoid. And I'll just have another sip of water. And then finally, I mean, also to take the distribution of power seriously, and think of in how far the vested interests of powerful economic actors, be it in the financial sectors, be it multinationals, might actually be one of the things that degrowth and post-growth must tackle more head on. And so from that point of view, I would identify important avenues forward for degrowth and post-growth economics. So it's and that has to do with like looking at the different proposals that degrowth makes with view to achieving not only growth independence but also break dependencies on profit, wage, money debt, and unequally distributed property. And so in terms of the political entry points, I would then argue that it's certain areas of political intervention should be emphasized. And this is, to think about alternative forms of ownership, specifically like common ownership, be it of resources, That can be technology also, when we look at that dynamic of increasing rentierism, that is profit making through the ownership, for example, of technology, of knowledge, through patents. Then we really need to think about what can alternative government structures of essential goods and services look like. Then the proposal for universal basic services has become more, a bit more popular in degrowth and postgrowth. And I think that is an important move, just because, the idea of universal basic services is of the provision of essential goods and services for free or at very low cost, but in a sustainable manner, and also organized and governed in a more participatory way. And in that sense, it could counter some of these, the capitalist dynamics by taking people out of that wage dependence in order to satisfy their needs, which would then open up different opportunities for people to engage for their activities. And it would basically also mean that we take out essential goods and services that are important for everyone to flourish out of that logic of profit, and thereby change the quality and possibility of provisioning. So I think that's there should be a focus on that, and how that can play out in different with different services in different countries. That's number 2. Of course, I will speak about alternative forms of democratic macroeconomic coordination. So that's something I've been looking at in recent years, because what is striking is actually, while degrowth and postgrowth makes this proposal for a very large-scale transformation, and also criticizing, at least to some parts, the capitalist markets, gross profit-oriented provisioning, there is very little engagement with, and very few proposals actually to say then, okay, what can replace at a macroeconomic scale the market-oriented and market coordination. And so here is it's interesting to look into debates around planning, as Stefan mentioned just before. But it's actually, I think it is quite telling that there is quite little research on that, and there are a few alternatives. Just it shows kind of how the dominant economic discourse, how theories and methods and political discourse have really not been conducive to facilitating this research. And that is like in economics in general, but also, and I think we still see the effects in degrowth. But here there's also like movement on that side, and I think that's something to engage with further. And then and then about global economic, monetary, financial hierarchies, I think there we also still need to, much more needs to be done, especially when we look at, globalized, financialized capitalism, the limits that it poses, for example, for countries in the global north, but even more so for countries in the global south, to actually pursue autonomous development, or however you want to call it, pursue autonomous political economic pathways. And so in order for degrowth to be an alliance, it's also about to come up with proposals that actually target the global economic and financial hierarchies. And I will close with highlighting the importance to actually consider to also include strategic considerations that are key for any implementation of such program, and which will need to also move beyond the realm of policy making, but also to look at the political possibilities in terms of alliances in global north, south, but also between different classes. And so on. And I think here the real projects will probably make contributions on that side, but I think there is still a lot to be researched in order to help prevent the worst of ecological and social breakdown. And lot, and I look forward to the discussion.